Republicans are trying to make the case that the FBI has become a hotbed of deep state liberalism, intent on purging the agency of patriots and real conservatives. Joining us now is former FBI agent Peter Strzok and Mary McCord, former acting assistant attorney general for national security at the DOJ. She is also a co-host of the MSNBC podcast, Prosecuting Donald Trump. Thank you guys both for being here. Peter, as a former FBI agent, I must ask you about this idea that the FBI is a hotbed of deep state liberalism. True or false?
Alex, absolutely false. Look, I spent more than 20 years in the organization. It is absolutely a conservative organization, whether that's politically, whether it's in terms of its view of law and order, whether it's in terms of sort of broadly in a societal sense. It isn't something that is talked about. I mean, it is just sort of the culture is one that is generally conservative, but it's not. People don't sit there having political discussions over the lunch table, but to assert in any way, shape, or form that it is a hotbed of liberalism is absolutely absurd, and nothing could be further from the truth.
Yeah, it seems like, indeed, nothing could be further from the truth, Mary, because NBC had reporting that not only was the FBI not a hotbed of, like, hippie liberalism, in fact, an unnamed FBI official warned last year, I believe, or before the January 6th attack, we learned of this last year, that an FBI official warned that there is at best a sizable percentage of the employee population of January 6th of the FBI that felt sympathetic to the group that stormed the Capitol. I'm getting my timing wrong all over the place here, but just to repeat this reporting, there was a warning that a sizable portion of the FBI employee population was sympathetic to the January 6th insurrection. That does not smack of liberalism. That smacks of something entirely different. Can you elaborate on that?
Yeah, you know, that's been troublesome reporting ever since that it came out. And, I think that there is still a big difference between maybe some people in the FBI who might have thought, OK, there are people who believe that there was fraud in the election. Some of those people got swept up in this. There's a difference between members of the FBI who might think that and others like the men you were speaking about before the break who were testifying today on Capitol Hill, who actually it appears from the reporting and from what's been reported about the letter that the FBI sent to Jim Jordan about why their security clearances were revoked, that reporting suggests far more than sympathy. Sympathy is concerning, but it actually suggests that active measures were taken to try to suppress investigations into January 6th attackers, and also to, not cooperate with the arrest of someone for whom there was an arrest warrant. And so those types of things are very, very concerning. I hope and believe that that's not the predominant view among the FBI. As Pete said, it's a conservative organization generally, and I think the lean to think it's a hotbed of liberalism is quite the opposite of what it is. But I do hope that these views that we're hearing today are quite the minority.
Yeah, Peter, on that note, it's not just that these men are being proposed. It's not that there's nothing their security clearances are being revoked. There are punitive measures that we're taking against these so-called whistleblowers. But in the same turn, Jim Jordan, who's the chair of the Oversight Committee, is lauding them as brave Americans and heroes. These are people who potentially did not investigate insurrectionists, who objected to their arrest, who hid investigative activity. I mean, that is deeply problematic for the FBI. What did you make of the way in which those problematic behaviors were flipped on their head entirely by the chair of the Congressional Oversight Committee today?
Yeah, well, it is concerning. Look, the last thing the FBI needs is some hyper-partisan congressman trying to take the FBI's action, the FBI's employees, and try and make it into a, one side versus the other sort of organization. Look, in defense of the FBI, the fact of the matter is really complex investigations and prosecutions of the Oath Keepers, of the Proud Boys, have taken place with FBI investigators working with DOJ and have been successfully prosecuted, involving investigation all across the United States. So by and large, the vast majority of the FBI is doing their job without fear or favor and just pursuing the facts wherever they lie. The problem is the FBI is a large organization, and with 35,000 people, you are going to find people on both extremes. And so when you get people like Congressman Jordan who select these people who are on the far right with really outrageous behaviors, that to lose your clearance, to have it revoked, not suspended, but revoked, gone forever, you have to really engage in some rather extraordinarily dangerous behavior. And for Jim Jordan to take those people, to take that behavior and somehow try and champion that as what is to be expected or should be expected, is really sending the wrong message to the American people. And it's absolutely nothing, I'm sure, that the FBI wants to hear from him.
Well, and Peter, the second part of that is he's using them as a cudgel against the FBI. I mean, and it appears to be working, at least if you listen to right-wing media. Laura Ingraham yesterday said, I don't know anyone who trusts the FBI anymore. This is coming on the heels of the Durham report, which purportedly was an explosive an expose on how the investigators investigating shouldn't have been investigating. I mean, I just wonder what you think the end game is here, given that we're talking about the FBI and there's legitimately a phrase out there that people are repeating, and it goes something like defund the FBI. What's the end game for Republicans?
Well, the end game is to try and neuter any sort of possibility of investigations of Trump. There are multiple things going on right now, certainly through Special Counsel Jack Smith, but other things related to Trump, whether it is, the things with the Special Counsel and the Mar-a-Lago document process, all the January 6th activity. The goal is to undermine support of the FBI so that they cannot effectively pursue any sort of an investigation of Donald Trump. It's not going to work. Now, the problem, of course, is these FBI agents, the ex-FBI agents that we've saw, have some of these extreme views. And the question is, where did they hear them? Well, the answer is, in many cases, they heard them from places like Fox News. So you get this sort of echo chamber where Fox and others are promulgating these crazy theories. Agents and others are listening to them and believing them, and then are turning up on these same shows to further, amplify and bounce right back into that ecosystem. So it's a dangerous cycle, but at the end of the day, the goal is to make it harder for the FBI to pursue any investigations or violations of the law surrounding Donald Trump.
Yeah, Mary, I wonder what you think about that, because we know from some reporting in the Washington Post that there was a disagreement between FBI field agents and DOJ prosecutors over the search of Donald Trump's property down at Mar-a-Lago. Do you think this new narrative that's emerging about the FBI being somehow anti-conservative will affect its ability or its desire to investigate all corners of Trump's potential criminal wrongdoings?
I really don't, because I agree with Pete here. I mean, it's a huge organization. I think most of the agents, I worked with FBI for more than 20 years in my career at the Department of Justice. And I can say, we didn't have political conversations. I never felt like anyone was making any decision. Now, granted, I wasn't investigating the former president of the United States, but I was involved in some pretty sensitive investigations. And I guess I shouldn't say I wasn't investigating the former president of the United States, because Pete and I both were involved in the Russia investigation while we were still in government. But my point is, I never saw anything that suggested to me that politics was infecting their work. And I think that to the extent that there are disagreements, and sometimes there are, often there are, within the FBI, within the Department of Justice, and between the Department of Justice and the FBI about tactics and strategies with respect to investigative measures that will be taken in a case. Those things happen, and they happen even in uncontroversial cases. And so, but ultimately, the buck stops. If it has to go all the way to the Attorney General, that's where the buck stops, and decisions get made. And if an agent can't do their job, that agent would get removed from the case. But I think that most of the agents will be, doing exactly. They're working with the prosecutors. They're working the investigations. And I feel confidence in their ability to get the job done.
Peter Strzok and Mary McCord, thank you guys both for joining me tonight. Really appreciate it.